Okay, so this is a guide to literature paper 2, English literature paper 2 GCSE, a guide to the exam. So the first thing to remind you of is, the structure of the exam. But first of all, I just want you to see a version of the exam from the past, so that you don't get lost in this big booklet that they publish. So as before with paper 1, all the questions for everyone in the country are published in one booklet. So you have to find your way through it. So the front will look a bit like this. Paper 2, Modern Text and Poetry, is a long exam, 2 hours, 15 minutes. We'll go through that in a moment. But the important page for you is the contents page. We're lucky again because In Spectacles comes up first. There it is at the top, page 4. So that should be exactly the same in your exam, In Spectacles first. And then once you've done your In Spectacles question, you do have to find the power and conflict question for the power and conflict poem section, and you will have to flick through. Bear in mind that other schools do a different cluster called Love and Relationships, so you'll have to flick through the booklet, and it'll be kind of all the way down. You go through all the different texts, blah, 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 until you find section B, and then you've got to go a bit further to find power and conflict. There it is. And there's the question. It was a war photographer that year in 2019. Once you've done the power and conflict poem or poem comparison, the next section is easy to find because it's the next bit, section C, unseen poetry, and there's 2 questions in section C. The first one is the main unseen poem, the second one is the comparison. I'll go through this in more detail in a second, but the point to make here is that you do have to sort of find your way through this booklet again. But the important page to bear in mind is the contents page. Will always tell you the page number to find the question. Okay, so having found, before that we'll go through the timing. So it's 2 hours 15 minutes. That sounds like a very long time, but it will go quicker than you think, and you need to be writing almost continuously in that time. And it breaks down like this. So have the breakdown in your mind. It's not as complicated as it seems. It's easy to get lost in 2 hours 15 minutes, but it's essentially 3 sections of 45 minutes. So you've got In Spectacles. First of all, you don't have to do any clever different order or anything like that. You can do the whole paper straight through. So start with In Spectacles, 45 minutes, 9 o'clock in the morning to 9:45. With In Spectacles, you get a choice between 2 questions. So you only do one question. That's something that people can make a mistake with sometimes. You only do one question. It's a choice between 2 of them. I'll go through what kind of questions will come up in a moment. And then 45 minutes on the power and conflict poetry. Again, it's one question. Compare the given poem with one other. So they give you one poem and you compare it to another poem of your choice. So that's 45 minutes, 9:45 to 10:30. And then the third section is unseen poetry. There are 2 questions in this section. So one is the unseen poem analysis, and that's the most important one here. And you should spend 30 minutes on that, and that's 24 marks. It's the one where you just see an unseen poem, hopefully, and usually it's quite a short one, and you have to analyse it according to the question they ask you. We'll go through an example a little bit later. The second question in the unseen poetry section is you having to compare another unseen poem, again quite a short one, in very quick time, 15 minutes, to the first one that you've just written an answer about. Quite complex, but you only have to compare the language. More about that in a moment. So In Spectacles, first of all, In Spectacles is 30 marks plus 4 for SPAG, spelling, punctuation and grammar. You get a choice of 2 questions. So what I want to talk about here is what's come up before, what sort of questions could come up, and which question should you do. And I'm going to make a suggestion. Obviously it's up to you in the exam. On the left-hand side, there's 2 main types of questions. There's theme questions and character questions often have themes as well. but they're focused on a particular character. But these are things that have come up in the past. Last year we had 2 theme questions actually. You have to pick one, you don't have to do both questions, but we had a choice between what life is like for women and the response of older and younger generations last year. Other themes that have come up have been inequality leading to tragedy, society as being unfair, men as being irresponsible, male characters, selfishness and social class. So those are all the themes that have come up in the past years, and you might be able to notice quite quickly that those themes are quite similar to each other in a lot of ways. So what life is like for women compared to men. So it's essentially about the divisions between women and men and what they expect from life and their roles in life. The division between older and younger generations. You've got inequality leading to tragedy. So inequality is a division between, essentially, it could be gender, could be old and young, but it's probably usually rich and poor or social class. Society's being unfair. Society's unfair for lots of reasons, but it might be to do with being unequal, rich people, poor people, higher class, lower class. So it's a similar theme. Men being irresponsible. So again, men being irresponsible and mistreating specifically women. So that's sort of gender is implied there. Selfishness is a little bit out there because it's just about being personally selfish. But of course, Mr. Burling being selfish as a capitalist, Mrs. Burling being selfish as a head of a charity is to do with social inequality as well. And social class at the bottom one, again, social inequality, upper class, lower class, upper class, working class. The difference between someone like Sheila in the upper class and someone like Eva and how she lives in the lower classes. So even though the themes seem different on the surface, there's quite a lot of similarities between those theme questions. The characters that have come up before are all these. So, and in order going backwards, so the inspector's come up in the past. He's come up twice before. There he is at the bottom as well. Eric's come up twice. Gerald's only come up once. Mr. Burling once. Sheila once. Mrs. Burling once. So that's the sort of characters they've focused on in past exams. So it's very difficult to judge who might come up this year because essentially all the characters have come up before, some a bit more than others. Key context for an inspector calls. So this is just here, this slide, to remind you of the key context that you need to know about. Remember, the play is set in 1912, but written and performed first in 1945. So set before World War I, but written just before the introduction of the welfare state, so benefits, housing benefit, unemployment benefit, National Health Service, etc. Other contextual ideas, socialism versus capitalism, explains what those are there. And class is an important context coming up in the questions. Age, older and younger generations, has come up as a question before, so that's an important context. And attitudes to women is an important context as well. So the patriarchy, women's rights, and suffrage at the bottom here, which is the vote, which is women getting the vote, which happened after when the play is set, but before 1945, in the sort of early 1920s, really. Okay, so that's context to keep in mind. And I recommend, in the exam, you can do whatever question out of the 2 that you have to choose from that comes up. So, make your own choice depending on what you feel strongest about or feel best with, feel happiest with, most confident with. But I recommend this. If I was doing the exam, I would do this. If there was a theme question, if a theme question comes up, then I would choose that. There were 2 last year. Now, this is because if you get a theme question, you can write about a range of characters and you won't end up running out of ideas for one character, which could happen if you just choose, if Eric comes up and you've got to just write about Eric, it's possible to run out of ideas for what to say about Eric. Okay, so up to you, but I would choose a theme question just for that reason, because then if social inequality comes up, I could write about Mr. Burling, I could write about Sheila, I could write about the inspector, and I can think of good ideas for each of those characters, and I won't be sort of, struggling to think of what ideas to use in my answer. Okay, so the next section is power and conflict poetry. And it's 30 marks for this section. You'll be given a poem and the question will ask you to compare it to another poem from Power and Conflict. So you need to choose that poem that you compare the one they give you to. So there'll be a list of poems that you've studied in the question book to help you with that. So, what you've got to do with this is make sure you focus on the theme of the question, which will be there, and you can point out similarities or differences of theme, methods, or contexts. Let's just quickly have a look at that question. So that was the Inspector Calls one with the choice. Again, you have to scroll all the way down to find, or you won't be scrolling, you'll be turning pages to find the right section. The poetry section, section B, begins with love and relationships. So that's not your group of poems. That's what other schools do. We do power and conflict. So here it is on a bit further down. Power and conflict, they give you a list of all the poems you studied so you can remember and choose from that list. And then on the next page, they give you the question and the poem that's chosen that you have to compare to. So you've got compare how poets present the ways that people are affected by war in War Photographer and one other poem from Power and Conflict. So the question is always going to be exactly the same, except for this bit, are affected by war in War Photographer. Okay, so tomorrow, until Monday, it will be like, compare how poets present the ways that people are something theme in whatever poem they choose. And you've got to choose one other poem, and they'll have the poem printed there. So we don't know what's going to come up, but I can tell you what has come up in the past. So it's about hopefully recognising the poem that is printed in the booklet, and then working out a good poem to compare it to. So I always group the poems in these groups, and sometimes that helps you to compare. Poems that have come up before are Starred. So there's Ozymandias, there's London, My Lost Duchess came up last year. Bayonet Charge, I think I'm right in saying, it's come up twice. So it's sort of unlikely to come up again. Remains, War Photographer have come up before. These poems that are starred, they have come up before, but they might come up again, it's possible. And it's untrue to say that Tissue, for example, won't come up. It could come up. So any of those poems that could come up, the point is to be able to recognise the poem that comes up, but also have a poem to compare it to. So I would recommend, making sure you know at least one or two from each group that you know really well and you can quote from. So that's why it's difficult, this section. For example, if you know Ozymandias really well, and a poem comes up that you could compare it to, such as, say the prelude comes up. Imagine, it hasn't come up before. Imagine the prelude comes up. It's about the power of nature. And Ozymandias, to some extent, is about the power of nature. It's about the power of nature to destroy human endeavours, like the statue in Ozymandias has been destroyed by time and by natural forces, and perhaps by people. But those two work nicely together because they're both about similar themes, or you can link them, and they're also both romantic poems. So they're in that same group. Sometimes it's good to compare the war poems together. So if a war poem comes up, like if Exposure comes up, it will, compare nicely with any of the other war poems, because it's on a similar theme, but has a different attitude to war probably than most of the other war poems. Okay, so unseen poetry. You get 30 minutes on the first unseen poetry question. Don't forget there's 2 questions in this section. And it's 24 marks. The unseen poem is almost certainly going to include a big, important metaphor or simile. They usually have a big metaphor or a big simile in that poem. So part of your job is to spot that. You don't necessarily, if you see other things, if you see other things going on in the poem that you want to write about, you can write about anything you like in terms of the language of the poem. But it's almost certainly going to have a big metaphor or simile, because those methods are really, really important to poets, and they're used often. So have a look out for those things. You can also write about and explain word choice. So if you're stuck and you're looking at a poem, you think, I don't know what to say about this, pick on particular words that seem important. So if you're stuck, focus on explaining how individuals' words make you feel and respond. Find the metaphor, simile, word, whatever it is, identify it, explain what it tells the reader and how it tells us that. You'll gain marks here by explaining language or structure in detail. Always choose quotes that you can say a lot about for the unseen poetry. So if you have a quick look at what unseen poem came up in 2019, there it is. It was called The Richest Poor Man in the Valley. You might have seen this poem in class. But straight away you've got on the outside he seemed older than he was. Oh, before I mention that, I should look at the question, shouldn't I? Always look at the question first. So, how does the poet present ideas about living a happy and contented life? So the question will often have a theme as part of it to help you out and look for ideas, ideas about living a happy and contented life. So if I have that idea in mind, the first thing that strikes me actually is, you get to the end of the first verse. His face was like a weather map full of bad weather. I mean, that's his face was full of bad weather. That's kind of a simile and a metaphor in one. Like a weather map makes me think of kind of lots of lines on a weather map, lots of lines and signs and marks. And maybe his face is old and lined and marked. However, that doesn't really fit with living a happy and contented life. Next line, full of bad weather. It sounds like a metaphor to me. His face was full of bad weather. It's a good metaphor. It doesn't seem like it's about living a happy and contented life, though. And then finally, in the first verse, I find this: his heart was, inside his heart was fat with sun. Okay, so this sounds a bit more happy and contented to me because it's about the sun, and it is a metaphor. So the challenge here is to explain what that means. His heart was fat with sun. Is a bit of a weird one, to be clear, but his heart was fat with sun. It sounds like he's got sunshine in his heart. Ignore fat for the moment. Fat kind of might maybe send you in the wrong direction, but sun in his heart as a metaphor, most people could probably kind of work out what that means, I think. It sounds like he's got a lot of happiness in his heart, because his heart, despite his face being a bit grumpy and full of bad weather, his heart is sunny. And that's what I mean about spotting that big metaphor, linking it to the question and trying to explain that. And that's what you need to look for in the unseen poem. So the second section of the unseen poetry section is only 8 marks, but it's worth trying to chase those 8 marks. It's 15 minutes at the end of your exam. I would recommend just making sure you write an answer to this question and you try and get as many marks, grab as many marks as you can. And it's a really weird question because you only have to compare the writer's use of language and the effect of this use of language on the reader. So if you see a metaphor in both poems, compare them. And that's how to approach this question. If one poem uses a metaphor and one a simile, explain the difference. And that's how to do it. Literally do it as quickly as you can. Pick up as many marks as you can. If you get 4 or 5 marks out of 8 in this question, you are really doing really well. And that's, most people, a lot of students won't get to it. So you must make sure you get to it. A lot of students will only pick up 2 or 3 marks. So aim to pick up 4 or 5, by making sure you compare language and the effect of this on the reader only. It's all that this question is about. It's all you have to do. And that's the way to pick up the marks there. So generally how to gain marks, just to recap, Make clear points, sharply focused on the question. So that's why you should always read the question first in everything that you do, so you know when you're looking at or thinking about your answer. You're looking at the poems again, you're looking at the unseen poem, you know what your focus is already. Use quotes, use the best quotes, because there's some quotes that you might pick out that you can't say much about the language, and actually that won't get you very far. It might get you certain way up the mark scheme, but you won't get all that far. Pick the quotes that you can say the most about. Explain the effect of language techniques on the reader so that you can, again, gain the most marks. Identify those language techniques, you get marks for that. Explain what they make you think or feel or understand about what you're writing about. Explain important context. This doesn't count for unseen poetry, but for Inspector Calls and conflict poems it does. Write accurately, as there are marks for spag on Inspector Calls, and in capitals, answer every question. And that's really important because if you miss out any questions at all, even the little small one at the end, it could cost you a few marks or even a lot of marks, and that will definitely impact your grade. Whereas if you grab a few marks here, a few marks there, even on the smaller question at the end, that might make the difference of a grade. So you're chasing every mark. Okay, so pitfalls, last thing here is to try and avoid these pitfalls. Inspector Calls, again, you get a choice of 2 questions. Make sure you choose and answer only one of them. That's really important. Choose and answer only one question, but choose the question that you think is going to be the best one for you, and try and make that choice definitely, and don't go back and forth and say, oh no, I decided not to after all, and cross a bit out and start again, because that will cost you time. Make sure you compare the power and conflict poems. Make sure you have clear comparisons so that you're picking out marks for comparison, because that is what the question is about. And on the unseen comparison, you only have to compare the use of language or structure and comment on the effect. You don't have to make points about the meaning of the poem, particularly beyond comparing the use of language or structure. Good luck in all of that. It's a very long exam, but bear in mind that once you've got that one under your belt, you will not have, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think you've got a longer exam in the whole series of exams you're facing at the moment. So good luck with that. If you have any questions, just email me, and see you soon.